And welcome back. So in our fourth video, we're going to talk about blood pressure and how we regulate blood pressure. So we need to make sure that we have a high enough blood pressure to perfuse our tissues and give the nutrients they need, but we don't want it to be too high because a super high blood pressure could actually cause damage. And so we have a lot of different variables that are regulated through both the nervous system and the endocrine system, our two control centers. So short-term regulation is going to be through the nervous system. So I will remind everybody that our heart beats on its own. It does not need nervous innervation, but the nervous system still innervates the heart, and it can help in controlling how fast or slow the heart beats. And so we have a cardiovascular center in the medulla that sends both sympathetic or parasympathetic stimulation to slow or increase, so increase or slow the heart rate. And those same blood vessels stimulate blood, or the same nerves stimulate the blood vessels to either vasoconstrict or vasodilate. And so here, this pink nerve is what stimulates the heart and blood vessels to slow down and to vasodilate. Well, it depends really on which blood vessels, I should say, but some blood vessels to vasodilate and others to vasoconstrict. And then we have the sympathetic cardiac nerves that increase the heart rate and are going to have an opposite effect on the blood vessels. So those that vasodilate in the in parasympathetic are going to vasoconstrict in sympathetic system, and vice versa. So on our blood vessels themselves, we have different types of receptors, protein receptors. Alpha receptors are going to get stimulated by our sympathetic nerves, cardiac nerves, and they're going to constrict, and that slows blood flow to the majority of our body cells. So think about it. When you have sympathetic stimulation, you're in that fight or flight system and you are trying to survive some activity, right? That puts you in that fight or flight mode. So the only organs that are super important in sympathetic system are your respiratory system, cardiovascular system, and skeletal system, as well as nervous system. And so beta receptors are going to vasodilate in response to the stimulation. And so these blood vessels open up, allowing for more blood flow. And that's going to be like to our brain, to our heart, to our skeletal muscle, and our respiratory system. Alternately, if we stop stimulating using the cardiac nerves and we have parasympathetic stimulation, then we're going to have an opening or a vasodilation of the nerves due to alpha, when the alpha receptors are no longer being stimulated. And we're going to have a vasoconstriction when the beta receptors are no longer being stimulated. And that is when our parasympathetic system is taking over. So in sympathetic, we're going to have more blood flow to the skeletal muscle, to the heart, to our nerves, and less blood flow to other regions. And then if we reverse it, we have more blood flow to all of our regions, and blood flow slows down to skeletal and the heart and our nerves. That doesn't mean it stops, it just slows down. We also have receptors in our blood vessels that send signals to the cardiovascular center. There are baroreceptors. These are pressure receptors that are going to send signals dependent on how high or low the blood pressure is. If you have a very low blood pressure, they send signals, and it's going to cause vasoconstriction of those blood vessels to increase blood pressure to where we need it. If we have really high blood pressure, it's going to send a signal telling us to vasodilate, relaxing those blood vessels so that we can lower that blood pressure. And we have chemoreceptors in the same area. So most common areas are, we have chemoreceptors in our aortic bodies of the aorta and in the carotid body of the carotid arteries. These are going to detect changes in pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen levels. An increase in carbon dioxide levels or a decrease in pH is going to stimulate the resistance or a higher resistance in the arteries. So we're going to increase blood pressure, pushing that carbon dioxide out of our system, which then raises that pH back to where it's supposed to be. Inversely, if we have a very high pH or low carbon dioxide levels, we're going to relax those same blood vessels to allow the carbon dioxide to sit in our system, and that helps to lower the pH back to where it's supposed to be. The hypothalamus and the limbic system, they also work together to alter our blood pressure. So hypothalamus, of course, you have the fight or flight response, sympathetic, parasympathetic. That's what stimulates the fight or flight response. But we also have changes in body temperature. So if you have an increased body temperature, you're going to want to move that blood through your system faster, which is going to increase pH to try and push that blood to the surface of our skin so we can decrease body temperature. And inversely, if our body temperature starts to lower, we can vasodilate those same blood vessels to keep the warmth in. Limbic system is going to alter blood pressure associated with emotions. And then we have long-term regulation of blood pressure. So we've talked about some of these hormones produced by the endocrine system. We talked about epinephrine and norepinephrine produced by the adrenal medulla, stimulated by the hypothalamus. That's neural regulation of the endocrine system. And so they are going to stimulate that fight or flight response. We've talked about antidiuretic hormone and how it increases the amount of fluid in your blood by increasing the number of aquaporins we have. Aldosterone increases the amount of sodium in our system, and where sodium increases, we're going to also have an increase in water, so that increases blood pressure. So angiotensin 2, we haven't talked about yet, which we'll talk about. It also is going to increase blood pressure. So we have angiotensin 2, antidiuretic hormone, and aldosterone, all that increase our blood pressure. Then we have one hormone, which we did talk about briefly in the endocrine system because I just love the name, atrial natriuretic peptide, which is a hormone produced by the atria in response to high blood pressure. And when it is released, it has the opposite effect of angiotensin 2. And so it lowers blood pressure so that you don't have such high blood pressure that it could cause problems with the heart or blood vessels. So we're going to talk about these hormones in just a moment. I think this video has been 9.5 minutes. I think this is a great stopping point. And then in our next video, we'll talk about how these hormones influence blood pressure. Bye.